Okay, fine, fantastic. Thanks for that suggestion. Right. So what I was saying was that in India, one of the most important things to remember, and of course we all know this, is that there's a very, very large section of India's population that is still, despite all the so-called development, directly dependent on natural ecosystems and on nature, natural resources for their daily survival. This includes food, medicine, livelihoods, etc., etc. And so when we have a situation of environmental destruction, deforestation or the draining away of wetlands or pollution and so on, it directly translates into livelihood insecurity, food insecurity, and so on. So this is a overall context that I think is very, very important to remember. I'm going to take you through a few slides of looking at the background of food and ecology in India and why it's so very important to talk about biodiversity. So if you look at our agricultural heritage, it's several thousands of years old, maybe millennia. And over these millennia, very complex and very diverse ways of living with the land, with forests, with wetlands, with the coast, with animals, with plants have developed. So these are knowledge systems that are extremely sophisticated. They are knowledge systems which have helped to develop an incredible diversity of crops and livestock. Just to give you an example, normally if this is a face-to-face session, I would stop at this point and ask people, okay, how many rice varieties can you name? And of course, in most parts of India, I've got maybe people have been able to name 5 or 10 varieties at the most. And then when I ask how many rice varieties will there be, people are kind of very surprised when I talk about the fact that we have probably something like 50, or had, not have, 50,000 to 300,000 varieties of rice across the country. Many of them now lost, but this has been the diversity. And even with mango, the season that's coming up, something like 1,000 varieties, and many other things of millets and all kinds of other crops. We are also the center of origin for more than 120 crops that are grown around the world. The same thing with animals.
Ashish, the slides are showing in duplicate. There are two of them. Is it showing us one on your screen?
It's showing us two in mine, but hold on.
Could you click on like full page or something? Probably it will solve it.
Yeah. I've got another screen on in which it's just showing one single one. So I thought that's what's happening. Hold on.
Oh, okay.
Ashish, you can carry on. It's okay. We can see.
Yeah. Hi, Milan. Yeah. I'll just try it once. If it works, fine. Otherwise, we'll just carry on.
Yes, now it is one. I think you need to go to the slideshow.
Click F5.
On the bottom right, you will find a slideshow icon.
That's what I thought I put. Yeah, see, I click slideshow and this is what happens.
I think this is fine, Ashish. I think you can go ahead.
Yeah, I guess this is better than what it was earlier.
Yeah, I'm not sure why two things are showing. Yeah, I'm clicking on slideshow, but it's just coming back to the double. Something in the PowerPoint.
This is pretty readable. I think we can continue.
This is a lot better than the previous setting anyway.
Okay. All right. So I just continue. Sorry about that. Yeah, I was just saying that the same thing with the kind of diversity of livestock that we have in the country. Just a few figures there on your screen. and what's I think very, very important about this is, and something that's completely forgotten in scientific circles or in development circles, is that this is not just stuff that's been picked out of nature. It's actually been deliberately bred by farmers for all kinds of purposes, for resilience against disasters. So for instance, there are many rice varieties that will grow even if there's a very serious drought, or in West Bengal and Bangladesh, there are rice varieties that will grow even if there's 6 or 8 feet of flood water. Or there are varieties of plants that are grown just for the medicinal purpose, including rice, or grown only for using in weddings and other kinds of ceremonies. So there's a whole bunch of survival, physical, material, cultural, spiritual needs that are met by this kind of diversity, and it's the product of thousands of years of cultural evolution that farmers, pastoralists, fishing communities, and so on have worked with nature. Most of which has unfortunately been disappearing or been ignored in modern agricultural development. And I'll come back to the consequences of that. Something very similar, and this is also something very badly neglected, is the immense importance of uncultivated foods. We have probably something like 10,000 species of wild plants and some animals that are used for all kinds of purposes, many of them for food. And these are very crucial supplements in the diet of millions of people, especially during disasters. So when, for instance, if there's a crop failure, there's a good forest nearby, there are things that they can fall back on. But even in a day-to-day life, there are tubers, mushrooms, all kinds of things that are used from the forest as food supplements, which are very, very crucial. And of course, for fishing communities, it's almost all from the wild. It's from wetlands and from coastal ecosystems. So, and for many Adivasi communities, also some levels of hunting or use of wild forests. And I will again come back to this issue of uncultivated foods when we talk about strategies. Now, unfortunately, our model of development in the last few decades has meant the enormous destruction of nature and natural habitats and agricultural systems. These are just a few statistics on your screen. I'm not going to go into any of this in great detail, but this is part of the current context of the crises that we are facing. Even as we try and push a certain model of development, we're actually reducing the survival skills and resources of tens or maybe hundreds of millions of people, those who are directly dependent on ecosystems, as I said in my first slide. And even if you look at agricultural development, while it has, of course, all these different revolutions of various colors, have increased the production of food grains or milk or fish or whatever, they've done that at a huge ecological and social cost, and at the cost of being very, very unsustainable. So massive amounts of lands have been gobbled up by so-called development projects like mining and so on. There's a huge dependence of farmers now on chemicals or on other external inputs and on the government or on corporations. The extensive use of monocultures, both in farming and in pastoralism, has meant the loss of diversity. So if there were, let's say, 50,000 varieties of rice, today there are less than a few thousand in the fields. And a lot of different kinds of, or diverse kinds of agriculture have been neglected because of the immense focus on irrigation and irrigated rice or wheat or whatever. Dryland agriculture, which is still actually what most farmers in India practice, has been very badly neglected. So too with shifting cultivation, small scale fisheries, and so on. It's not a surprise, therefore, that we have this horrifying statistic of 3 lakh people, 3 lakh farmers committing suicide. This was many years back. It's probably now many more. And if we see what's happening right now with the crisis, this figure is likely to jump up significantly unless there's...
Ashish, sorry to interrupt. The slide has not moved on the screen. If you're giving numbers on the suicide, I can still see India's agriculture biodiversity.
Okay, I don't know what's happening because in mine, I've got destruction of India's agriculture. It's not there?
No. Yeah, even others are saying they've not seeing the change.
Yeah, it's the same.
It's static here.
Okay, I don't know what's happening with
Mhm.
it's moving here in mine.
Okay.
Maybe you can do one thing. You can stop sharing
Maybe
and start again.
stop share again and restart. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, what do you see now?
Um,
You see destruction of India's agriculture? No.
We see
yes,
this.
yes, we can see it.
Okay. Anyway, I just went through this. So, yeah, basically talking about how agriculture development has really meant uh, both the short-term and the long-term destruction of the survival base, and also the kind of ecological sustainability that our agriculture needs. So what we're seeing therefore in India, not just with agriculture but generally, is basically two Indias. So we have the one which has leapfrogged into the 21st century, fifth largest economy in the world according to the finance minister recently, with the high growth rates in general, except in the last 2-3 years, and so on and so forth. So if you look at the sort of normal indicators of development, India is doing reasonably well. But the flip side is as important, if not more so, which is the kind of enormous inequality that we see here. The latest figures being that 5% of Indians, including possibly some of us on this call, earn as much as the other 95%. And if you see the current crisis of migrant labor or those who are on daily wage labor, it's because of the fact that we have had a development model which has kept 90% of workforce in the informal or unorganized sector on a daily wage basis, more or less. So it's extremely insecure, except, of course, for those in that sector who are still able to depend on healthy natural ecosystems or healthy land. But other than that, it's a really, really serious crisis, which then also translates into a very severe food crisis. Number one, that if we're thinking about food, not just in terms of the amount of food that people have, but also how nutritious it is, whether it's a balanced meal or not, then possibly 2/3 of India's population is deprived as of now. We have the statistic, the pride of having the world's largest number of malnourished or undernourished women and children. If you see, there was a very good recent report in Frontline on that. Healthcare, which should have been completely in the public sector and should have been easily affordable, is more and more becoming unaffordable because it's being privatized. And again, we see the consequences of it right now. And all of this is the sort of fault lines in our economic developmental model, and the fault lines in the kind of inequality that we face are showing up very starkly in this current crisis. And it's going to become much worse in the coming season with food shortages and water shortages and so on, unless there's a very drastic change in strategies, both in short term in terms of relief and welfare and so on, but also in the long run, because this is just one crisis. We would face another one very soon, whether it's to do with another pathogen or climate or something else. And we have to be able to change course. Are the slides working all right now?
Yes, they're working fine.
Is they working in the old double format?
Yeah, but
Okay.
it's fine. Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so the big question that arises is, are we kind of doomed to go along in the same direction, or are there alternatives? And that's what I'd like to turn to now in the rest of my presentation. So while asking that question about, do we have alternatives? Do we have other ways of meeting people's food needs and livelihood needs and so on? I think it's very important to ask ourselves, alternatives to what? It's not enough to say, okay, the alternative would be to make sure that the government provides food to everybody, which is there in the Food Security Act right now. It's not enough to say that, okay, we need to have public provisioning systems by which people have livelihoods. It's not enough to say, even for instance, that there should be 100 days of guaranteed jobs. We need to be able to go to the structural roots of why we are in this crisis. And to me, if one is to put it somewhat simply, it's about the concentration of power, about who takes decisions, whether it's, for instance, the concentration of power, economic power in the hands of private corporations in capitalism, or its concentration of power in the hands of a state which is increasingly becoming authoritarian, as we see around the world, or it's in the hands of men over women, which is, of course, ancient, or various different kinds of caste hierarchies, race hierarchies, ethnicities, and so on. And finally, of human beings over other species. So this is, I know it's simplistic, but I think it's one way of looking at, if we want to talk about alternatives, we need to be able to fundamentally challenge these structures and find what are the alternatives which are not oppressive, which are not exploitative, which are not unsustainable. And that's what I'd like to turn to now. So one of the most important parts of this is resistance. We have seen in India huge amounts of resistance movements from historical times, movements against mining, against mega hydro projects, against patriarchy, against casteism, and so on and so forth. And to me, these are very important parts of the alternatives, because not only do they slow down the, say, the bulldozer of development, but they also provide an alternative viewpoint, an alternative cosmovision or worldview of what well-being is, what development is, what people feel is just and equitable, and so on. This particular image that you see right now on the slide is of a anti-dam movement from 30 years back in central India on the Indravati River. And what the Adivasis here were protesting, when they were protesting, they were saying, they were telling the government that when you see the river, you see megawatts and electricity. For us, the river is our mother. So it's two very different civilizational viewpoints, and there's a clash between the two. And that's why resistance movements become so important for us to be able to be told, to see, to hear that modernistic development as we've seen it is not the only narrative around. Resistance is also helping to retain, at least in some places, existing systems that are still resilient, still viable, by protesting against land grabbing, forest destruction, and so on, by resisting. In fact, amongst the earliest post-independence movements was by the small-scale fisheries, fishing communities against big trawlers and commercial fisheries that was being brought in the name of fisheries development, or resistance against the use of chemicals, GMOs in agriculture, and many, many more. But even as resistance movements are so crucial, we also need to have proactive, constructive, positive movements for meeting people's needs and aspirations, because there is deprivation. It's not as if we just stop all development right now, destructive development, then everything and everybody will be fine. And that's one of the things we've been doing in the last few years, is documenting stories of where people are on the ground working these practical alternatives, trying to meet their needs in ways that are more ecologically sustainable and more just and more equitable. I will give a few examples, and the first one is going to be the example of the video that I started with. This is a very, very inspiring story of about 3,000 Dalit women farmers who maybe about 30 years back faced the same kind of deprivation, oppression, casteism, untouchability, etc., that Dalits have faced, or women have faced across the country. And of course, very serious food insecurity, lack of access to health, and so on. In these last 30 years, what they've done is mobilize themselves into Mahila Sanghams, women's collectives in each of the about 65, 70 villages, collectivize a lot of their farming operations, share traditional seeds, completely go back to organic, create a grain bank in every village so that people have access to grains to sow, or those who are landless, for instance, have very cheap access to healthy, nutritious food. Go back to a huge diversity of millets and local rice varieties and so on. And through all of this, create not just food security, which is important, but also food sovereignty. Their argument is that when it comes to food and water and so on, we should be in control. Why should any corporation or any government be controlling our food or our water or our knowledge? And so it's been this movement towards a combination of food sovereignty, ecology, because to do this, they also need to sustain the productivity of the land. They need to sustain the trees around them. They need to sustain the biodiversity of the fields. Just to give you one example of an inspiring woman, this is Vinodamma in the same area in Telangana, who I went there about 3 years back, and she was growing in 3 acres of land in a year in which there had been 40% less rainfall, 45 different varieties of crops, enough for an entire family of about 7 or 8 people, plus enough to be able to sell in the market and make 2 lakh rupees at an expenditure of just 18,000. Completely local seeds, completely organic. And she is now championing this across the whole district, going from place to place and saying, this is how dryland farming can be successful. They have created now their own local consumer shops in Zahirabad and also selling in Hyderabad. They have a direct connection with a couple of hundred consumers in Hyderabad, and also created their own local public distribution system. Interestingly, in each village, 1 or 2 women have the local grains and people can access them for very cheap. I just spoke to Jayashree, one of the activists in DDS today, and she tells me that I was asking her what are they doing with regard to COVID. And it's very interesting. What she said was the women have no food problems because there's enough food in the fields or on the farm, but they're also donating a kilogram each. So they're donating 20,000 kilograms of food grain to the district for food relief for those who don't have food. They're sharing with the landless workers in their own villages. They're giving 1,000 glasses of millet porridge every day to police workers, health workers, and municipality workers in Zahirabad town, and much else. So I mean, it's so incredibly revolutionary, right? That the same women that have been oppressed for centuries are actually able to now help those who are still facing problems. There are many other examples. I'm not going to go in too much into them because of lack of time. Here's one in Bihar, which till about 6-7 years back was using lots and lots of chemicals, hybrids, and so on. They've gone completely organic with the help of Greenpeace India, and are now also turning back to a lot of their traditional varieties of crops. And they're trying to see how they can sustain a more localized exchange so that they're not dependent only on the external market for their livelihoods. Natwar Sarangi is an Odia farmer, quite old now, but he started about 15 years back, completely gave up his chemical farming and started going around all of Odisha and Chhattisgarh, collected more than 400 varieties of, more than 400 varieties of rice, which he's been trying out on his farm and then distributing back to farmers, saying, how can you do very productive organic rice cultivation with traditional varieties? Vanastri is an organization of women in the Western Ghats who are trying to revive their traditional varieties of vegetables and fruits, and also their sustainable consumption from the forests itself, and to revive their home gardens, because home gardens used to be one of the most productive systems of but was lost out in the race for commercialization or in land grabbing and so on. So trying to revive that with a lot of the knowledge of the women themselves being brought back into practice. In fact, this whole issue of sustaining wild foods has now become very, very important. And you can see that, I think, right now, especially with this current crisis, is that where forests are still intact, or where wetlands are still intact, or where coastal ecosystems are still intact, people have access to food from the wild. And this makes it so very important to combine the agriculture or cultural knowledge practices and so on with the conservation of natural ecosystems, so that it's not just dependence on farms and cultivation, but also on wild ecosystems for food, for nutrition, and of course for a whole lot of other needs. we have been carrying out or doing once a year or twice a year wild food festivals in a wildlife sanctuary close to Pune, where there are several villages that live in the forest there. And similar wild food festivals are organized by Deccan Development Society and many others to try and bring back this relationship with natural ecosystems. There are others that are also equally important. So for instance, this is in Gadchiroli district in Maharashtra, an Adivasi area, where 90 villages have got together to form a federation, a Mahagram Sabha. They started this because they had to protest against and stop a mining project that was being proposed by the government. But then they also started mobilizing themselves to see how can we self-govern the entire region? How can we protect the forests? How can we claim the rights to forests and then be able to use those rights for sustainable consumption and harvesting, and also empowering women, because even though in Adivasi societies women have a more equal status than non-Adivasis, they have almost never been involved in village level decision making. So there's a deliberate process of trying to capacitate and empower the women to have equal voice in the Gram Sabhas and in the Mahagram Sabha, and reassert their Adivasi identity. One of the interesting news we just got 3 or 4 days back was that some of the workers who had gone out from these villages and have come back because of the lockdown, the Gram Sabha has been able to collect enough money in the last few years through the sale of small-scale timber, small-scale forest produce, to then enable these workers to actually have a bit of an income, or at least to have enough food to carry them over this particular crisis period. Sorry, I'm hearing some. Is everything okay?
Yes, we can hear you. There's a disturbance. I'm trying to see who it could be.
Okay.
And everybody, please mute your mics apart from the speaker.
Okay, so similar to what's happening in the Gadchiroli example I just gave, there are many examples of community conservation across the country, where people have tried protecting their local natural ecosystems or the wildlife that they live amidst. And I would imagine, we need to get many more stories from here, but I would imagine that wherever they've been able to do that successfully, they're probably in a much better situation than areas where the natural ecosystems have been destroyed in the current COVID crisis. There's also very interesting attempts at trying to create a better localized market or a better marketing mechanism through things like producer companies. So this is an example from the Timbuktu Collective in Andhra Pradesh, which has been doing somewhat similar work to Deccan Development Society in reviving traditional organic millet-based cultivation. So they created this farmers producer company so that about 2,000-3,000 farmers now can collectively market their produce branded in their own name, organic, certified by themselves through what's called the participatory guarantee scheme, so that consumers know that it's organic. And the proceeds of that go back equally or equitably to all the farmers, or is channelized back into further processing and production systems. So there's no one capitalist in control. It's a sort of equitably owned producer company. And there are many others like that. Then what we can also see is lots of examples of attempts to change the urban mindset on food. We know, for instance, that organic food is now much more easily available in many cities than it used to be even 5 years or 10 years back. It's still very expensive, and that's a challenge that I'll come back to in most cases. But at least there's an attempt to create an awareness about the fact that that health and food are so integrally connected. Bangalore has huge numbers of backyard or rooftop farming. Pune is also getting there. I mentioned the consumer producer link between Deccan Development Society, Dalit women, and consumers in Hyderabad. It's called Confarm. There are many others. There are non-profit shops or networks like Organic Food Network in Chennai or Restore that are trying to create the spaces for farmers to be able to sell their produce to consumers who want organic, and for the farmers to be able to get most of the revenues back rather than middlemen or middlewomen hogging those profits. So there's a lot happening even in cities that is kind of pointing towards the kind of transformations that we need. And then there are, of course, people's movements across the country, national or regional ones, that are pushing for policy changes also in this direction, because ultimately the spread of organic, biologically diverse farming will be much faster if there is also policy support for it. So these are some of the movements. Many of them are currently involved in the immediate relief work. Makam, for instance, is doing some really good work, reaching out to women-led households, widows, and so on, in and around Delhi or elsewhere, to make sure that they're okay in this current crisis, and if they need food, to be able to reach food across to them. Many others are doing the same thing across the country. Now, when this kind of civil society movement happens, of course, governments also respond. Governments are not monoliths. There are always good people within who are wanting to do the right thing. And over the last few years, we've seen a few such positive changes. Some laws like the Forest Rights Act, the Food Security Act, which I think is kind of flawed, but nevertheless one step in the right direction, or programs like organic farming programs in many states. Sikkim becoming 100% organic, Ladakh wanting to be by in another 5 years, Andhra Pradesh wanting to be completely zero budget farming, etc. Again, none of these are perfect, but they show the intent and the possibilities of policy shifts also that some governments are at least trying to do. Kerala, for instance, and how it's responded to the current crisis in terms of making sure food is available to everybody who needs it, is another interesting example of that. So one of the things we've done, if you take a look at that blog, it's a Vikalp Sangam blog that has just been started 2 days back to try and document these different initiatives that are taking place, which link the current relief measures for COVID crisis with more long-term perspectives on what kind of transformations are needed. So please do take a look at that. And if you know of more, please send them to us so that we can keep updating that blog. Just a quick slide. I love this slide because whenever I show this, people say, oh, why is it upside down? And I have to remind people that the so-called right side up normal map that we're used to is a colonial product. It was done to make Europe be on top and to look much bigger than it actually is. As you can see here, Europe is tiny and England completely disappears. But the other reason to put this map up is also to show that, similar to the examples I've given from India, there are lots and lots and lots of examples from around the world of this kind of radical alternatives. And there's a huge global network of agroecology, for instance, which is pushing for this kind of small farmer, sustainable, self-reliant, biologically diverse organic farming and pastoralism. And I'll show you the cover of a book at the end, which documents a whole lot of these examples. So I'm going to end in the next few minutes now by just showing you a kind of a framework of what I think emerges from these and many more thousands of examples, which has a lot of bearing on the current crisis and how we look at the long term. The examples I've given you show transformations in 5 different spheres, at least. So for instance, what the Gadchiroli 90 villages Mahagram Sabha is saying, we want to self-govern, which doesn't mean that we don't regard the government, but at least for all critical aspects of basic needs and so on, we should be in control. The Deccan Development Society Dalit women are saying food sovereignty, which is to say that at least for the basic economic needs that we have, we should be the one in control and not corporations or the government. So economic democracy, or Earth Shastra, bit of a pun there. The same women and others are also saying that we also need to be fighting the injustices of casteism or gender inequality or other kinds of inequality that we've had traditionally or which are coming up new in the modern economy. So the struggles for social justice and well-being are also crucial. In all the examples, there was a mix of traditional knowledge, still relevant, and perhaps what is good from modern science and technology. So the importance of cultural and knowledge diversity also becomes very important. The DDS women, for instance, celebrate every religious festival and link it up to the seeds and the earth and their ecology and their agriculture, even though they are all part of what could be called a Hindu society, but they will celebrate every religious festival, acknowledging the importance of cultural diversity, for instance. And finally, of course, none of this will work unless we also protect the environment and create the ecological resilience we want, because without that, we're all dead anyway. And some of us have called it, I think the book that was mentioned right at the beginning, In Churning the Earth, with Asim and I, we called it Eco Swaraj or Radical Ecological Democracy. A very simple concept that wherever we are, in whatever communities we are in, whether it's a village or a town neighborhood or a educational institution or other kinds of collectives, including some of the virtual collectives that we have now, we should be the ones who are central to decision making. We can't leave it to elected representatives, politicians, bureaucrats, and corporations, and so on. We should be at the center of this decision making. But even as we are, we need to be aware of it being ecologically responsible and responsible for other people. So the notions of sustainability, equality, equity, justice have to be at the core of this kind of decision making, which means that the following values that I'm putting up on the screen are really possibly my most important slide, because it's important to know that we're not going to be able to replicate a Deccan Development Society or a Natwar Sharangi or any of the other examples I gave you as they are somewhere else. But what we can learn is the crucial lessons, the ethics, the principles that they have used. For instance, cooperation and not hostile competition, or everybody trying to move up rather than some moving up and leaving others behind, right? Sarvodaya, or the notion of trying to live more simply. And this is something that I think we're all facing right now, because we're all having to scale down our consumption levels or our mad travels or whatever right now because of out of being forced to do it. But can we learn maybe that there's a voluntary way of also living simpler lives? Or the notion of self-reliance for basic needs, and so on. I mean, many others which I don't have the time right now to go into, but I think that's really this is the really crux of what these examples are trying to say. I think there's huge challenges, and I'm then going to leave it there. For instance, organic food. Why is it that in most cities in India, organic food is so incredibly expensive? So therefore, it's available only to people like me. And poor people who are eating street food have to eat junk. So how do we create a system in which, in fact, the organic food is as cheap or as reasonably priced as anything else? And one of the things is policy shifts. So for instance, 80,000 crores of rupees going into chemical fertilizers can be shifted to organic cultivation, making it much more viable. Or this whole issue of food security versus food sovereignty. Food security is a notion in which we say the government must make sure that everybody has enough food. And that's important in the current crisis, especially. But how do we move from there into a much more situation of food sovereignty, where people are self-provisioning, either in terms of producing their own food or having adequate income to be able to buy the food? How do we create an interest in the new generations? A lot of younger people are just leaving agriculture for good reason, not to blame, it's justified. So maybe this is an incredible opportunity for thinking about how do we go back to the land. I read the other day about Canadian Indigenous youth going back to their communities and learning from the elders how to live off the land, given that they have no jobs anymore in the cities. And so on. I think there's many such challenges there on the slide. I'm not going to go on and on about that. One of the things that we do in order to kind of try and create a much more solidarity amongst the different initiatives around the country, not just on food, but on many other aspects, is the Vikalp Sangam process. I'll put up a website a little later just to show you where what you can log into and be able to join a part of this. But here it's a sort of a platform to get organizations, movements, individuals to be together, to share things, to collaborate more, to create more of a critical voice for policy shifts and so on. We've had, for instance, 2 or 3 on food, which have been lots of food, but also lots of sharing of how different kinds of agro ecosystems, different kinds of cultures can create food security and food sovereignty. This also involves a lot of documentation. So here's a website which has, I think now, about 1,600 stories of transformation from different parts of the country on different subjects. So please take a look. If you're ever depressed by the news of COVID cases in India or elsewhere, shut down the morning newspaper and go to the website. It will cheer you up at least for a while, because there's some amazing stuff happening. Not that we can ignore COVID, but just to see that there is another reality also. 3 books that will give you much more. The first one on the left is a collection of 35 essays of people envisioning India in 2100 and seeing what's a dream vision for India in different subjects, right? So food, sexuality, health, gender, Adivasis, conservation, education, etc., etc. And then coming back to the current context, saying how do we get there? The second book is 100 examples of radical alternatives from around the world, including some that I had put up in that global map. And the third one is 9 or 10 very detailed case studies, including some of the ones that I've shared in this presentation. So I am going to stop there. That last slide, you can note down some of the websites that will give you much more on what I have spoken about.
Thank you, Ashish.
So thanks a lot. I hope I haven't taken too much time, and I'd be happy to have a much longer interaction.
Yes, so just to set the time limit, I just wanted to know how long can we be here for question answers? It's past 8:25 now. Shall I say 9?
So that's fine with me.
Yeah. Okay, so we already started taking questions in the chat. Whoever has joined later, please use the chat window so I know I'm looking there. I'll also answer you if you've raised your hand. I'll allow you to ask the question yourself. So right now, I'm assuming our people who've typed in, I'll ask on your behalf. So Anurag says there will be a limit to the number of people who can rely on agriculture with our growing population. What would be other sustainable job opportunities that can be created to stop migration to urban areas and make more people employable? I would assume in the space, in the rural area and agriculture.
Okay, do you want me to do one by one, or
I'll go with 2-3 questions, I think. So there's another from Kiran which says, is organic farming sustainable for growing population? And Chit, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Can I go ahead now?
Yes.
Hi. First of all, thanks, Ashish, for this wonderful, informative session. It's a privilege to listen to you. So thank you so much. My question is that as an activist, we see some challenges at the ground level where I will say system is very harsh. So system is very powerful, and there are many vested interests. So the corporations have lobby in the parliament. So of course they are very powerful, and they never let, even if government has a willingness to do something. So that is one aspect where I will say maybe system is corrupt or powerful or vested interest. That is one challenge. Other challenge is me also, people from middle class. We are also running for this Western lifestyle. So there's a huge influence of due to colonization or imperialism, neoliberalism, and still we are aiming and chasing this American dream and now the Chinese dream. So India wants to be the world's biggest, in terms of GDP at the top, or beat China soon by 2030. So where do you see hope in coming years? Do you see, because you're working on the ground also for many years, so what is the hope from this country, from the government, and also from the citizens, including us? That's it. Thank you.
Okay, should I do these 3, Rajni, first?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Yeah, thanks. Great questions. And of course, my answers are necessarily going to be a bit simplistic because of shortage of time, but I'm happy to continue the conversation offline on email or on the phone. Yes, so agriculture will not be enough. Sandeep, was that your question? Whose question was the first one?
Anurag.
Oh, sorry, Anurag. Okay.
Yes. The number of people who can take rely on agriculture will be limited.
Yeah. No, I have the question. I forgot.
Okay.
So Anurag, no, agriculture is not going to be enough in terms of creating livelihoods for, 500, 600 million people or 800 million people that need the livelihoods. It needs to be a mix of primary sector, which is agriculture, pastoralism, fisheries, etc. Crafts. Craft, in fact, is something that is or used to be a source of livelihood for 200 million people. So it's a huge, after agriculture, it's actually the second biggest source of livelihood. Unfortunately, because of industrialization, a lot of craft livelihoods have been lost or are being lost. But we're also seeing revival. So for instance, in Kutch, we did a 2-year study there of organic cotton-based handlooms. And it has revived so well that in fact, young people who had gone off to work in Adani or Tata's or gone off to the Gulf are coming back to work in handlooms in their family, with their families at home. So I think we need to have a very serious policy shift. Well, first of all, grassroots mobilization, but also the policy shift away from large scale industrialization and towards whatever can be produced in the small scale or medium scale should be done at that scale. Now, of course, this will encounter the kind of vested interest issue that that Chit talked about, and I'll come back to that. But so crafts, small scale industry. Another example is from this village called Kutumbakkam in near Chennai, where a Dalit Sarpanch called Ilango managed to use all the panchayat funds to generate small scale industrial jobs for about 300 families in the village. This was things like putting together solar kits, decentralized solar kits, making lamps, food processing, food grains processing, etc. And these were all families that otherwise had to go to Chennai for work. Now they can be in the village and do that kind of work. So there's actually an incredible range of options available. Even something like regenerating the 65% of India's land that is currently degraded could generate millions and millions of jobs. And one of the biggest demands has been, please use NREGS also for things like regeneration of land, for the protection of forests, regeneration of wetlands, and so on and so forth, because that's a huge possibility for employment. So yeah, we have to think of this whole diversity of options. The crucial principle there, what can be produced at a local level in a village or in an urban colony should not be produced by a large scale industry. That's a crucial principle there. Kiran, is organic farming going to be sustainable for the growing population? I guess nobody has a conclusive answer there, but I think we all, or definitely those of us who are honest enough in the agricultural establishment, know that chemical farming is not going to be sustainable because it's destroying the land. Production is plateauing in most of the early green revolution areas, including Punjab, Haryana, and so on, and it's going to plateau everywhere else if we keep pumping in chemicals into the land and so on. And I'm not even talking about the incredible health hazards, etc. So we have to be able to make organic, biologically diverse farming sustainable. And there are 3 or 4 things that are crucial for that. One, it cannot be monoculture. It needs to go back into things like, let's say, paddy along with fish cultivation, which was a traditional thing in Kerala. It needs to be things like crops along with livestock. Okay. And we have to try and bring back a lot of the land that's gone into cash crops like tobacco and so on, or even the incredible amount of sugarcane cultivation back into essential food crops. So there are a number of policy shifts which will also be helped or aided along if we also have consumer shifts. So if more and more of us start actually asking for millets and organic millets and so on, you will have farmers wanting to actually shift back because it becomes viable to do that. If the entire public distribution system was to be shifted to local procurement of organic, locally relevant crops, you'd see this huge shift taking place. If the entire midday meals system or the Anganwadi's food system was to be shifted similarly, you'd see this kind of thing happening. So this is very, very important if we want to make organic food be able to feed 120, 130, 140 crore people. Chit, absolutely. I think these challenges that you've spoken about, they cannot be overemphasized. I think they are huge. We have vested interests both within government and in corporations, but also, sad to say, including amongst ourselves, our middle classes, people like us who, for instance, like you were saying, with Western lifestyles wanting to go in a particular direction, and therefore also supporting the same vested interests that we are up against. So it's a huge challenge. There's no doubt about that. I don't want to in any way not give that enough importance. What I think provides us the hope is two or three things. One, that we are seeing more and more and more of the kind of people's initiatives that I spoke about. Okay, there's lots of them, and they're all currently swimming against the tide, but they're also trying to change the tide. And you can see that tide beginning to change in some places, like where Sikkim decides to go 100% organic, or Ladakh decides to go 100% organic, or Andhra decides to. Like I said, none of this is perfect. There are problems, but it shows that with people's pressure, which is both advocacy and showing the practical way of doing things, you can begin to see larger shifts also taking place, despite the fact that all of these states also have the chemical industry wanting the states not to change. But there is change that has taken place. And I can give examples in many other sectors like this. The second important thing, I think, is that even in the West, which is where we have imported all these problems, not all, but many of these problems from, there's huge rethinking taking place. It was already doing that with the environmental and the human rights movements. It began doing that even more with the climate crisis, or with the crisis of right-wing governments doing all kinds of stupid things. And now with the COVID crisis, you actually see more and more people in the West, this is especially in Europe, but even in the United States, asking fundamental questions about the current system and saying, can we do things differently? And in many cases also showing things that can be done differently, and looking for examples from the rest of the world to be able to guide them. So I think if we want to continue learning from the West, there's a lot that we can learn. I mean, for instance, cycling, very simple example. Across Europe, you will see in cities more and more and more people using cycles, more and more pressure to create cycle-friendly streets. Now, you really want to copy the West, let's copy that instead of the private car, which is what we've copied in the past. So I think we need to be able to figure out how we can cross-learn between the East and the West, the South and the North, to be able to also create the cultural shifts that are needed to fight against the kind of Western and or now, let's say, Chinese models that you spoke about. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to give Tamara's question some time. She's from the Northeast, and she has given 2-3 things. First, she said among the food festivals, she wants to tell us about the Biodiversity Festival in Chizami in Nagaland. It's held every year in March, and the story of the Buguns and the Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary in Arunachal. It's a very successful community conservation model. And then she asks, there will be, specifically in the Northeast where she lives, wild foods includes animal hunting and poaching. So how does one manage this issue in relation to food security? She also has a question about women and natural resource management is very closely related, especially in rural and the fringe communities. Also, women till the land, but the trading, management of land, the produce is very much still the man's domain. So she thinks that looking at issues of food security and rights to natural resources through a gendered lens would be useful. How does one tackle such things at the grassroots, she asks. And because there's also a question about grassroots, I'm combining, should I combine questions on local self-governance? Or do you want to take Tamara's question separately? Because it's quite a big thing that she's...
Yeah, I think maybe I should, because there's 3 questions and
Yes.
very important ones. So if that's okay, let me just
Yes.
try and respond. Thanks, Tamara. I am well aware of both the Chizami and the Bugun examples. Haven't been there myself, unfortunately, but lots of colleagues have. And I know of the organizations, both the Northeast Network and the ones in Arunachal that are doing this, the local Bugun community and the Titli Trust and so on. I think those are amazing examples. I think many more people in India need to know about them. I do know that now there's a couple of films on some of those initiatives, and we hope to circulate that much more, especially in the current crisis period when I guess a lot more people are just sitting on their screens, and we should be putting out this kind of material. So thanks for mentioning that. Very inspiring. With wild foods in the Northeast, including animals, yeah, I mean, I think this is a very sensitive subject. My own personal view on this is that where communities have traditionally depended on wild animals for their nutrition and or their food security, small scale hunting that is done for the local community needs to be acceptable. Now, mind you, I'm an animal rights activist, so it's not very easy for me to say this, but I recognize that communities have the cultural rights to do this and the food security needs to do this, right? The problem arises when that gets transformed into hunting for commercial purposes. And that is something that's happened across the world, not just in the northeast of India. I have been to Nagaland many times, not to Chizami, but other areas, and I've seen entire forests. The forests are intact, but no animal inside them. And I think one needs to figure out, but I've also seen several communities in Nagaland that are now protecting the forest and the wildlife, and wildlife is coming back. So one needs to figure out what is the balance between the household needs, the domestic needs, the nutrition needs, the food needs of the communities, and the need to also protect the wildlife populations against extinction or against being wiped out. And I think if we can figure that out, unfortunately, what's happened in India is that we've had this all India approach. So we have a Wildlife Protection Act, which applies across the whole country, regardless of local ecological and cultural situations. And that should not be the case. I don't think we should have a monocultural legal approach for the whole country for these kinds of things. So that would be my view on hunting. On women and natural resource management, so let me again turn back to the Deccan Development Society example, because one of the first things that these women fought for was also land rights. As almost all over country, of course, women don't have land rights. It's their husbands or their brothers or their fathers or whatever. And it was a big, bitter struggle, including against their own menfolk in the house, but they did succeed. And I think we need to use that kind of an example to also, across the country, including the Northeast, if women don't actually have the rights to land, that there needs to be, across the country, there needs to be a joint land holding that has to be encouraged and mandated. But that by itself, of course, is not going to solve all the problems. We also need to figure out, for instance, who controls the decisions with regard to what to grow, what to sell, how much to keep for the house. Why is it that crops are most important for, first of all, for domestic security and then only for the market? Again, principles that some of these movements have used. So it seems to me that this kind of movement is crucial. I'm very inspired to see, for instance, the national network Maqam, which I'm sure you've heard of, the Mahila Kisan Adivasi Manch, which is fighting precisely for these kinds of things, for women's equality in all matters relating to agriculture and land and natural resources. So I guess we just need to support these sorts of movements and spread them more and more. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So moving on to question on two related questions, one by Siddharth and one by Nupur on democracy and governance, because they're linked. I'm trying to link it. So Siddharth says, is self-governance, which the Garicholi Sangh asking for, the same as what currently Auroville has? He's comparing it with Auroville and the Gadchiroli Sangh, sorry. And Nupur says democracy looks like it's a game of people and its population. But when did it, with corporates and lobbies, become so important in democracy? So these two are related to governance and democracy. I'll also add to it Sandeep's question, which is on how do we unhinge from the craze of GDP? Geeta Seturaj says, will small scale and local farming promote sustainability?
I have something to add also to that related.
Okay, please keep it brief. Please go on. I'll mute myself.
Yeah. Ashish, my question is this. We have a certain paradigm now, and we have vested interests, as Chit was mentioning, fairly, entrenched. And any shift disturbs the system and there'll be a backlash. Two things. One, we're heading towards a mass extinction that's pretty much accepted across the scientific establishment. But the 99% of people live blissfully ignorant of that fact, continuing to destroy our habitat. And if we want to shift to a, let's say, a more sustainable option and possibly a possibility of saving ourselves from extinction and continuing to live on this planet, the only solution that I can foresee is localization. And that localization includes everything. Having to procure everything you have locally, grow sustainably, as you said, have food forests, have only handmade where industrialization is not required, and possibly shrink the space for industrialized products to possibly only things that we essentially need, like electronics and things like that, but otherwise make everything handmade. This is what I foresee. But how do we create an imagination for people to see that this is the way forward? Because I don't see that imagination in public parlance.
Yeah, three big questions. So I think take the rest later. Yeah.
Yeah, I missed the last one from Geeta. Can you either repeat or can we come back to that after?
Geeta, we can come back to it later because I think these three are big enough. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So yeah, Gadchiroli and Auroville, in some ways similar in the sense that there is an attempt at self-governance, for instance, or in trying to determine their own priorities for themselves in terms of economics and production systems, etc. But also very different. I think, well, first of all, of course, the histories are so very different, right? I mean, the Gadchiroli community has been around for hundreds of years. Auroville is 50 or 52 or whatever years old. So you can see, in terms of the depth of, there's something in a community that's a few hundred years old, which is hard to define, which a 50-year-old community will not have. There's a depth of understanding, there's a depth of cultural knowledge, there's a depth of ecological knowledge, there's something maybe even in the genes that comes about from this kind of long existence in one place, which will not be the case for a new community. And I'm not talking about things like the fact that Gadchiroli is one relatively homogeneous community, whereas Auroville has people from, I don't know how many, 50, 60, 70 countries, which has its own dynamics, interesting, positive and negative. But another very important difference, and I think this is crucial, Auroville actually doesn't have self-governance because its board of its managing board has the Tamil Nadu government, and if I'm not mistaken, even the central government on it. Which may have been one reason for them inviting Mr. Modi for their 50th anniversary inauguration, despite the fact that a lot of Aurovillians were very upset. So I think there's a difference, but there are also commonalities. Maybe it's a great topic for somebody to do a PhD comparing the two. Nupur, democracy, well, how is it that given what it was supposed to be, how did corporations become part of this whole thing? I think one of the reasons, at least one of the reasons, is that the form of democracy we have in all of our countries is a very distorted and very superficial form. If you take the message of the Gadchiroli Mahagram Sabha, what they're saying is democracy about us taking decisions, not about us going to elections once in 5 years and then basically sitting back and hoping that our elected representative or somebody else's elected representative will do the right thing for us. Democracy, the original Greek meaning, rule by the people, not rule by those who we elect. So unfortunately, because we've all fallen into the trap of thinking of democracy as primarily being about elections and political parties and so on and so forth, we have also given up our power and our space to those elected representatives to do what they want and to stay in power and even to fight the elections. They need to court those who have the money. And who has the money? It's the corporations or the rich, right? So in every single country that I can think of, including in countries run by the left, this is a huge problem. The only way to solve this, to my mind, is to actually rethink the basics of what democracy is. To go back to maybe what Gandhi said long back. When we got independence and Congress was forming government, he said Congress should disband. All the workers should go off and help villagers to become self-reliant and local republics, and not have centralized, concentrated power in Delhi. He was very against the centralized state, as you all know. If you can think of it, there's a very similar notion of communism that Marx talked about when he said the withering away of the state. Not state communism as we've seen, which is horrific, but what he kind of was talking about, or anarchy that many people talk about. So I think we have to rethink the basics. Now, this is a long, drawn out, very long-term fight, and whether we'll ever get there, I don't know. But if in the last 75 years we had paid much more attention to decentralized democracy in villages and towns, I think we would today have been in a very different situation than we are in right now, including with how to handle this particular current crisis. This doesn't mean that everything can happen at a local level, and this goes to the question that Sandeep put on localization. Absolutely, Sandeep, I totally agree that I think localization has to be the fulcrum of the responses that we give. I just wrote a piece on that recently with regard to COVID. The only thing I would add there is to say maybe open localization, because we also have a movement in many parts of the world, in Europe, for instance, of the extreme right wing also talking about localization. Well, for them, it's about keeping migrants out and keeping refugees out. So it's a very xenophobic kind of localization, whereas what we're talking about is a localization that includes ideas of justice and equality and so on, and empathy, and being able to reach out to people who are in need, including refugees, migrants, and so-called minorities and so on. So how do we get people excited by this? I think we need massive cultural shifts. We need cultural icons that can actually say that, oh, I made my own sweater. I didn't buy it from, I don't know, name your own industrial brand. And I don't mean icons that are film stars or whatever. It could be any of us. It could be 1,000 people today who decide this and say, okay, there's 1,000 people in India, young people in India who are going to wear handmade clothes, right? Or going to go back into farming, or going to support those who are currently doing farming, because we can't do it ourselves, but we can at least support them. And I think the fight for localization will have to be fought at that kind of cultural level. Plus at a consumer level, where we try and create more and more consumer movements that reject the kind of large-scale industrialized goods that we have and ask for localized goods. And this is a great time to do it. The Barefoot College, for instance, in Rajasthan, is now doing relief work with migrant labor and so on in their area, where much of what they're putting into the package for the relief work is produced locally. Not everything, but much of it. Or if you take, for instance, Kudumbushri, one of the state-supported women's movement in Kerala, one of their slogans is, are we so dirty that we need a multinational corporation to produce our soap? Why can't we produce our own soap? So these are the sorts of movements that will have to be spread. And I think they could become movements where young people also say, oh yeah, wow, it's cool to actually be using a locally produced soap. Why not? I mean, this is beginning to happen. Just like with cycling, right? It's now fashionable or cool to be cycling in Europe. So why not also similar things happening here? But along with that, I think we also need to push for the policy shifts. A couple of years back, I wrote a piece called The Need for a Sustainable Consumption Line. So just like we have a poverty line and we say nobody should be below the poverty line, we need to have a sustainable consumption line and nobody should be above that sustainable. I mean, I shouldn't be able to consume more than a certain amount of electricity or a certain amount of minerals or whatever it is. I don't suggest that this happen as a government diktat, because that could lead to another form of state authoritarianism, but that it begins to happen as a social construct, as a cultural construct, where, and what's that famous Onida ad? Owners pride, neighbors envy, or whatever it is. Let's reverse that. Let's reverse that. Where we say, okay, I don't have a fridge. I don't have a fridge. Oh gosh, you're able to do without a fridge. Great. How can I do that? So I know it's all sort of. Was I muted?
Yes, sorry. We wanted to mute some people who accidentally came. Yeah, only for a
Okay,
second.
okay. Sorry. So yeah, just to conclude that, I think if you look at it, consumer consumer choices have shifted dramatically in just 1 or 2 generations. Even when I was young in school, for instance, we didn't have this kind of pride in ownership. In fact, there was pride in being simple, at least to some level simpler, right? We used to use what's called the Gandhi pencil. Every pencil would be used till it was like this small and couldn't be used anymore. It was called a Gandhi pencil. And everybody came to school by bus or cycle. And the first kid who was dropped to school in a car by his parents was laughed at by all of us. Now it's the reverse. But if it can change in 1 or 2 generations, it can also change again in 1 or 2 generations if we are able to create the right kind of messaging. So I think that's your last thing was about GDP. Very, very interesting latest announcement from the New Zealand Prime Minister that they're not going to use GDP now in their development programs. They're going to use well-being. This is something that Bhutan has been doing for quite some time with varying degrees of success and failure, but at least trying to. And now New Zealand is also trying that. In fact, her entire budget speech was about mental health. It wasn't about economic figures and growth rates and so on and so forth. Germany is beginning to consider something like that. So more and more countries are actually understanding that GDP is a ridiculous, stupid figure, which should not be followed. And I think the more we can show how ridiculous it is, especially now, again, I mean, this is showing the hollowness of the GDP model, right now. We have the possibility of being able to shift to more holistic well-being indicators, and there are many of those that are available, which can be used to replace GDP if our governments are so inclined. But again, that's going to happen only if there's an adequate people's push and movement and civil society advocacy around that, showing how that's so much more holistic and sustainable and equitable and just.
Yeah, thank you. In interest of time, I'm stopping. I mean, we're not going to take any more questions. Couple of questions are there, 8. I hope you can all stay and listen to the answers. I've tried to group them. Like, I'll go back to Ms. Geeta Seturaj's question. This is regarding, will small scale and local farming promote sustainability? Then we have Arish Babu, who says, why is permaculture not a solution for sustainable farming? I hope I read it right. Yes, Arish Babu says that. And there's a question by Anurag, who says, will shifting to localized goods, soaps, for example, sorry, I'll take this later. I think I'll go with the farming related questions. Piuli says, can ideally local production, can you hear me?
I could hear you.
Okay. There was some noise in the background. Yeah, Piuli says, can an ideal local production for local consumption approach work for the future? I was assuming it's related to agriculture, so I'm taking that here. And I'm sorry, there are a lot of questions. Can I combine one more? This is about water and agriculture. Because there's a huge water scarcity, Janardana says it's going to be a big issue. There are so many river diversion projects which are in the pipeline. River linking is happening, not as a whole, but maybe 1 or 2 rivers. diversions of small rivers, ultimately this may move in the direction that of the larger river linking project. And the resistance he feels is very weak. What do you think? Is that okay? Or should I, do you want to take more questions?
No, no, let me deal with these.
Yeah.
In fact, I already, I couldn't note Geeta's again. So can you just repeat that quickly?
Yes. Will small scale and local farming promote sustainability is what she's asking.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So let me try and combine these. Geeta, I think, and also Piuli's, I think small scale is the only thing that's going to be sustainable. Small scale, small farmer based agriculture and pastoralism and so on is the only thing that's going to be sustainable. We have seen how large scale industrial scale agriculture is not sustainable. In fact, it's part of the current COVID crisis. If you see the latest scientific assessments that have been done on industrial scale agriculture and how that has created the conditions for pathogens to be released much more widely, we know that at least those of us who want to be scientifically honest know that industrial scale agriculture is not sustainable, apart from not being equitable and so on and so forth. So it is only the small scale farmer that's going to save us in right now and in the future. But those small scale producers need the support that I've been talking about. They need the movements, they need the collectivization, they need the policy support that I have already mentioned. Harish, permaculture is definitely part of it. So for instance, agroecology, which is the sort of catch-all phrase that people use, includes a very large diversity of approaches. There's permaculture, there's biodiverse farming, there's organic farming, there's lots and lots of different things, depending on where you are and who you are. The essentials of all of them are the same or similar, which is that one has to work with nature as being part of nature. We have to work with the land. We have to think of the land and seeds and so on as being not just material products, but also ethical, have to look at them ethically and spiritually and so on. So in some sense or the other, they're kind of similar. There are sort of, obviously there are differences in approach in all of them, but fundamentally they're all the same. So yes, permaculture is part of the agroecological solutions that I mentioned. Purely, partly I already responded to you, but I think like Sandeep said, localization of economic exchanges and of course also political decision making is the only way to go in the future. I just want to emphasize that there are many reasons for this. One is, for instance, that when you have face-to-face contact, it's so much more meaningful. If you can buy from a local farmer rather than go to a supermarket and buy something which you have no idea who has produced, it's a more meaningful way. You'll probably find the food tastier when you eat it because culturally also you've made a shift, right? And the same thing with the farmer knowing who is eating his or her food. It's such an important thing that my produce, I know who's using it, right? And one of the things that's happened in a lot of European countries now is local currencies. So they're saying, how is it that we can get away from the euro or the pound or let's say in India, the rupee? And at least for some essential exchanges, we can use our own local means of exchange, a local currency, like let's say, in fact, Auroville tried doing that. It didn't work very well, but they're going to try it again. But many European communities have that, where you can go and buy, say in Becky in Luxembourg, you can use that to buy bread in the baker. The baker can buy wheat from the farmer. The farmer can go to a doctor and get health services using the Becky and not using the euro at all. It localizes the exchange. It creates a social relationship along with an economic one, and it stimulates the local economy. So I think that's definitely the way to go. The only caveat being what I mentioned earlier, that this localization cannot be a xenophobic one where we say, okay, nobody from outside is allowed inside. It's only for Hindus or only for Muslims or only for whites or only for XYZ. We have to be careful that social justice issues and human rights issues are as much part of this. Janardhan, water. Yeah, I haven't mentioned that. It was there in one of the slides, but this is going to be, in many cases, a make or break situation. The way we manage and govern our water is going to determine a lot of things in future, whether we break out into all kinds of wars and conflicts or we create greater solidarity across political boundaries and so on. So how we govern our rivers, for instance, what this means is that radical ecological democracy also is saying that our current political boundaries also need to be questioned. For instance, the boundary between India and Bangladesh, which means that Bangladesh, which also needs the Ganga, and India, which also needs the Ganga, but India can make a Farakka barrage and stop water flow from going into Bangladesh, or right now what's happening with the Indus between India and Pakistan, or what China might do in stopping the Brahmaputra in its own country. These things are a result of political decision making in the past, which has been completely ignorant of or deliberately ignoring ecological and cultural contiguities and so on. So we're talking about an eco-regional politics, a bioregional or biocultural regional politics, which tries to look at these sorts of connectivities. And of course, water then is absolutely central to that, because that's what connects the whole world together, right? Rivers are the arteries of the earth in some sense.
Yeah.
So we need a very different. So river linking, big dams, all of that has to be opposed. I do recognize what you're saying is that currently the opposition is weak. We are all weak compared to the powerful who are pushing these sorts of projects. We just need to network much more, work with each other much more, stand in solidarity with local people's movement that are protesting against the dams and so on that are coming up. Whether we win in the end or not, I don't know. But it's imperative that we continue struggling against these mega projects that are destroying our water systems.
Yeah, thank you.
I should
I'll ask.
mention, sorry, just one quick thing, that there is currently a committee under Mihir Shah that's looking at national water policy. And Mihir and a number of other members on that are very, very aware of these issues. They've been doing a lot of good progressive work. I'm surprised they're on the committee. But Mihir is chairing that, and I think this is a good opportunity to at least try and get in a policy framework that is much more progressive. It may never be implemented, but at least we'll have that on paper to push for and lobby for.
Nisha Kumari,
Yeah, in Karnataka also there is some new policy drafted. He contributed to that policy. Thank you, Ashish.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Vishnu, can you please unmute yourself and ask the question, because...
Yeah. Hi, Ashish. Vishnu from Bangalore here. The recent statement by pluriverse authors, "Can Corona Save the World?" quotes Bayo Akamalaf in saying how the whole construct of the universe defies thinkability and framing. And if since you quoted Bayo in that, I want to ask you then how does alternatives look from that post-humanist angle that Bayo always advocates, which says that man is dead and we just have to settle for that. In such a philosophical tradition, then how would alternatives come into being, was my question.
Okay, should I go for that, or there's one or two more?
Do you want to club two more questions? I couldn't hear Vishnu very well. You got his question?
Yeah, I got his question.
Okay.
I'll repeat the question when I answer.
No problem. Shall I go with one more question from Nirzai? She asked specifically about two things. One is the plastic menace, and the other is architecture, sustainable architecture. I know they're not related, but I'll go with both her questions. Yeah. Can you discuss a little bit on the ongoing work that needs to be done to tackle the plastic menace, overhaul in packaging of almost of everything that urbaners consume, which is resulting in air, land, water pollution?
Yeah, okay. Vishnu, very deeply philosophical question. I can not possibly do justice to it. In general, I can't do justice to it, but certainly I can't do justice to it in 1 minute. So I think there are aspects of what Bayo writes and says, which we would agree with, including what we had quoted there, which is to say that we're in such an incredibly complex situation right now that it's past even being able to be defined or understood in its entirety, right? So that's the meaning of the thing. And so therefore, what's very important in terms of what we wrote, or what I would say, is that it's all the more reason why the pluriversity or the pluriverse of alternatives, the extremely diverse knowledge systems, cultural systems, languages, ecologies, etc., that we have around the world, that we still have to some extent, have to be protected in order for us to be able to start making sense of the world we're in order for us to have multiple different answers and solutions, so that if something doesn't work, we have at least another 100 to fall back on, rather than one monocultural way of trying to define progress and development, etc. So that's the sense in which I would take what Bio wrote. In terms of post-humanism and his thing about humanity is dead anyway, or man is dead anyway, yeah, I don't personally agree with that. I think humanity has the potential of transcending itself, at least in its current state, and being able to re-establish a coexistence with the rest of nature, to think of ourselves again as part of nature and not excluded from it, and to say, okay, what are the kind of fundamental course corrections that we need in order for us to again be part of a responsible part of nature. And I think that's where we need to look at indigenous peoples around the world. Not that they're perfect, not that there aren't problems in them, but at least many of them showed us ways of living that were explicitly and in practice part of nature. They didn't think of themselves as being out of it. So, and in fact, in response to COVID, many of the indigenous peoples have come up with what they think is the kind of solutions that we need out of this crisis. So that's the way I would look at his work. So some agreement, but not full. Mirzai, plastic menace. I think this goes back to earlier discussions about consumerism, consumption, our lifestyles. Where is it that as consumers, we can make a shift and a change from very small things like making sure we take our cloth bag when we go shopping and not accept plastic bags, to demanding and going for and frequenting zero waste shops. Now there are zero waste shops in many cities. Unfortunately, elitist and expensive, but it's a trend that we could try and push for, also making it accessible to poorer communities. So to actually start again thinking of ways by which we can do a lot of things without plastic. So that's a consumer movement part of it that I'm saying, but also then the advocacy against the kind of production of plastics that is there. So for instance, for a long time, Government of India and state governments had banned, plastic carry bags below a certain micron range, but they didn't ban the production, which is stupid, right? So, I mean, we have to start advocating for that kind of thing. The Waste Pickers Women movement in Pune, KKPKV Swachh, they have been writing to Procter and Gamble and others saying, why do you produce things in plastic that simply can't even be recycled, like Lay's chips, for instance? So that kind of advocacy also has to be very much part of this. And that has worked in at least some countries in the world which are moving away from plastic, at least for a number of things. It's worked. There is a huge vested interest in the plastic manufacturing industry, of course, that has to be fought against. But equally important is the vested interest in our own minds of what we think of as convenience, what we think of as something that's packaging that's worthy of the product and not worthy of the product, etc. So it's these mind shifts, cultural shifts that have to happen along with the political advocacy and policy shifts. Architecture. One of the examples I always give when I do these presentations, which are more rounded and not just on food and ecology, is the example of something like Hunarshala in Kutch, which has shown, it's a group of architects that has shown how you can combine traditional forms of architecture with modern principles and modern forms of architecture to create extremely durable pakka houses using, say, mud, but in different forms in different parts of the country because there are different ecological conditions. Or it could be bamboo or wood. So the creation of, including in cities, not just in villages. In Northeast, for instance, there are examples of 3-story buildings using bamboo. And some state governments have also been promoting that. So I think the move towards sustainable architecture is a really, really important one, because building construction is one of the biggest impacts on the environment. And also on our health. I mean, the way we make our buildings these days, we are so unhealthy, we're living in such unhealthy conditions, or need much more air conditioning or much more heating, whatever. Another interesting example is from Ladakh, the complete opposite of Hunarshala, which is in 40 degrees heat in Kutch, showing how you can make buildings that don't need air conditioning. In Ladakh, SECMOL, Sonam Wangchukle's organization, have created an entire learning institution, a very big institution, using passive solar technology and architecture, which means that even when it's minus 20 degrees outside, they don't need artificial heating inside. So there's lots of possibilities of learning from tradition and building in modern architecture principles also to create much more sustainable, much more eco-friendly, and much more livable kind of buildings. But again, we're up against huge vested interests. So it will have to be a combination of showing its practical and political and policy advocacy that pushes urban planning especially and rural planning towards this kind of sustainable architecture. And if you have stories on that or can help with that, we'd be very happy to involve you in some of these processes.
Yeah, thank you. I'll move on to Anjali and Aniruddha's questions, which are Anjali asks, how do we address the juxtaposition between, as an example, moving back to local native food practices such as fishing, when mass consumption, which is fed to the general population by industrial marketing. For example, is considering sustainable fishing at this point even a possibility? In the same line, Aniruddha addresses the city self-sufficiency. He says, how can we incorporate farming, fishing areas in cities to ease pressure on villages so that we can even make cities self-sustaining? And for me, the last question is from Kishore. So can I ask you go through that? So Kishore thanks you for the great talk, and he's asking you currently the growing development projects in eco-sensitive areas, which are going to impact wildlife, create conflict in both protected, non-protected areas. What do you think we should do about it? I think he refers to the most recent MOEF positions, and also a lot of state governments have done similar actions. Views on delay in implementation in FRA, especially in the Northeast, and also many other areas in the country. So those are the questions I have from the chat window. I have one more from Joe. This is related to democracy. Should I ask you that? Yeah.
Go on. Yeah.
Joe says, do you think democracy would have saved us? I think he means democracy in the true sense, would have saved us from the coronavirus pandemic. Yeah. And
okay,
in case I've missed anybody's questions, kindly private chat me. I'll quickly summarize your question after Ashish. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks. Anjali, yeah, okay, so the juxtaposition between localized food production systems and the industrial scale food production that we're seeing, or the consumption, industrial scale mass consumption that we're seeing now, it's going to be a very difficult uphill battle. Like I've been saying all along, part of it is cultural. It's cultural shifts that we have to have. That rather than going to a supermarket and buying an industrial branded product, can we start demanding that we need outlets where farmers can come and sell their produce and we buy directly from farmers? There are now many places which have farmers markets that enable us to do that. And then we also talk to the farmers and say, hey, listen, we'll buy at slightly higher price if you give it to us organic, right? So these are the sorts of changes that will have to take place. To my mind, in the ultimate analysis, it's not about whether small scale localized food production can be sustainable or not. That's the only thing that will be sustainable. And if you see right now, in fact, there's a very, very fascinating story from Satara, that in the COVID crisis, because the farmers were not able to get their produce into the more nationalized market system, they, along with the help of a local district officer, built up relationships in Satara town itself.
Your sound is on.
Sorry, what's on?
You weren't audible for about 30 seconds.
Okay, so I was talking about Satara. Did we get till there?
Yes.
Yeah, so I was just saying that again, in response to this, to Anjali's question, that one of the most interesting stories that came to us 3-4 days back was in Satara in Maharashtra, where local farmers could not get their produce into the usual national markets. A local district officer and the farming groups there, they worked together to create the consumption base in Satara town itself. So a more localized form of exchange was made possible so that farmers had access to consumers and consumers had local food. I think we are in a situation where much more of this needs to be promoted. And right now is the time we can promote it, because that's the easiest thing to do. It's happening in Gurgaon. Somebody has created a whole online system by which consumers in Gurgaon can buy locally organic food that is produced by farmers in that area. And for every basket that is bought, there will be a basket of free food given to migrant labor. So we need many more of these to be able to create the movement against mass industrialized production and consumption systems, even as we fight for policy and political shifts, right? Anirudh, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And again, I think I probably...
So sorry, Ashish, I'll just, Anjali's adding that she wanted to clarify that her question was about the quantity. How can our demand be met by local production? Not just...
Okay, I understand that. But Anjali, if you look at it, all production is local. It's just about where it's going after it's produced locally. You can't have a non-local production, right? Production of crops has to happen on land, and land is local. It's just that right now we have a system in which that local in Punjab is taken 3,000 kilometers away to Tamil Nadu. And rather than do that, we say, why not local in Tamil Nadu being sold in Tamil Nadu, or around Chennai being sold in Chennai? So it's not about the quantity. The quantity is still there. It's just where it's moving, how it's moving, who it's moving to, and who's benefiting out of that, who's making the profits out of that. So if, for instance, Food Corporation of India was to procure locally and store locally, you would have localized exchange taking place. Why produce in Punjab and take into Tamil Nadu? Right? So, I mean, and this can't happen overnight, of course, because it's not as every place has enough production, etc. It needs to happen gradually over, say, 5 years or 10 years. But it can happen because every production ultimately is local, right? Does that kind of respond to your question?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Anirudh, yeah. So I think the example that, of course, we're all familiar with and has come back in the COVID crisis right now as a great example is that of Cuba and Havana, which produces a very substantial part of its food needs from urban agriculture. Now that happened in a particular situation and circumstance. We can't necessarily reproduce that, but if you take a look at it, that part of that circumstance was United States embargo on Cuba. Now think of COVID as an embargo. We are currently all in a situation where we can't necessarily access things from far away. We have to try and start thinking about more self-reliant systems. And that would include cities. So let's start thinking about how can we produce more. So if Bangalore has 10,000 people that are doing some level of rooftop or backyard gardening for some aspects of their food, that kind of system or model can be extended much more. They also have an annual, or I think every 2 months festival in which they exchange their, what I've grown on my roof, I can give to you, and what you've grown on your roof, you can give to me. It's never going to be completely, no city, at least at the scale that we have cities in India, is going to be completely self-sufficient. I don't even think that's necessary and good, because I think we still need the relationships between the consumers in the city and the surrounding farmers. But at least some elements of it can be produced within the city. And that also is a great hobby. It's a great activity, getting our hands dirty with, I don't do it enough, unfortunately, but getting our own hands dirty with production. It also enables us to actually see how difficult it is and maybe respect our farmers much more. So I totally go with what you're saying. Urban agriculture has to be emphasized much, much more than it has been so far. It will also mean recommoning of lands. This is something that's happening in parts of European cities where people are saying, instead of car park, we're going to convert this into an urban agricultural plot, and the 40 families that live around it will be doing collective farming. So that kind of thing can happen in India also. Why do we give so much space to our cars and so on, our private cars? Let's just take it away from them and do urban gardening in those parking lots, right? Or golf courses or whatever. Kishore, so I think there's a whole lot of stuff that's going completely wrong in our development model. Projects in eco-sensitive areas, protected areas, including the ones that have just been given clearance by Javadekar, is horrific. I mean, I can't find adequate words to express my dismay at what's happening, but it's been happening for quite some time now, especially since 1991 when globalization was started, but even before that. This particular government has made it much worse, but it's not qualitatively different from previous ones. The only way we can stop it is to continue protesting and building up our advocacy around it. Go to court, protest in it through petitions, sit on dharnas, support the local movements where these projects are coming up, and very, very importantly, those of us who work on wildlife conservation, let's correct our huge mistake of alienating local communities from wildlife conservation, which means that they are no longer available to us to be in the forefront of fights against mining in the same protected areas because they've been displaced or their access to the resources have been stopped. So we have to change the model of conservation also to be much more inclusive, where then the local communities and us are joined together in fighting against mining or highways or whatever is being built in these eco-sensitive areas or protected areas. So we need much more of that. Forest Rights Act, brought in at a particular point in time, particular political combination of forces that brought the Forest Rights Act in 2006. But the same government that brought it in was not as keen to implement it. This particular current government is even less keen to implement it. So other than some parts of Maharashtra and of Odisha and a few other states, it's been not implemented almost anywhere else. Maybe 4 to 5% of its potential implementation has taken place with regard to community forest rights. Many reasons. The Forest Department doesn't want to give up its power. States don't want to give over lands where they are eyeing for power stations or mining or dams or whatever it is, because once you get the rights, communities can stop these projects, which is what's happening in, for instance, in Gadchiroli, right? So there are many reasons for why the FRA, Forest Rights Act, is being delayed or not implemented. Again, the only thing that's going to work is adequate community mobilization with support from civil society, legal support, other kinds of support, which is what has worked in some parts where it has been implemented much better, like in Gadchiroli, in Maharashtra. Would radical democracy or true democracy have saved us from COVID? Not just that, Joe. I think if we had moved towards both radical political and economic democracy, along with social justice, the kind of model I've been talking about, then yes, possibly we could have been saved from something like COVID, because one of the main reasons why COVID spread so fast is because economic globalization has enabled the rapid movement of people and goods all across the globe. And we are excellent carriers of pathogens. Apart from the fact that these pathogens have also emerged as a result of ecological destruction, industrial agriculture, and so on. So if we had had radical ecological democracy and economic democracy, which is to say much more self-reliant communities, which are still engaging with each other in cultural ways and so on, and even some economic ways, but not in the way that we are hyperlinked right now across the world, then perhaps it would have affected a much lesser number of people, would have spread much more slowly, would have given us the possibility of being prepared much more than is currently the case. So I would say, I definitely think so. I can never be sure, of course, but I think that would have been a much more different situation. And this is why we're arguing that let's do it now, because even with COVID will disappear in another 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 1 year, maybe once we have the vaccines for it, etc. But something else will come up if we continue with the same system. That's why the crucial need for long-term measures to also be kicked in right now, even as we do immediate relief measures.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to summarize the last question. It's from two people actually. Indira ma'am, Indira Jaisim. She says I think she knows you, and she's asking, can you talk about, sorry, I'm not able to pronounce that. Yeah. Helena
I got it.
Norberg.
I got it.
Yeah.
I see the chat. I can
Yeah,
respond.
yeah. Thank you. Insane trade that Helena Norberg talks about. She also says Auroville has developed solar passive architecture for hot climates. She's added that. So I'll end it with the last question from Sanjay and Nisha. Both are in the session still. What kind of minimalism habits in daily lives so that we do not cross the line of sustainable development? And Nisha says, can you suggest some potential sustainable social enterprise business, specifically any views about business practice in India? And I think that's the last question I would take. There are some questions on current crisis. Do we have anyone who can connect organic farmers in Gurgaon? Others can answer that in the chat window, please. Yeah, thank you. And Ashish, would you be open with, would you be okay if we share your email ID with all the participants who have left their email ID?
Absolutely, absolutely. And
Okay.
I'm also happy for the presentation to be shared, or I can share the link where the presentation is available. And please, everybody
Yes.
feel free to use it the way you want. It's not copyrighted because none of it is mine. It's all stuff that I've learned from others. So please feel
Yes.
free to use it in any way that you want. And yes, email me if you have any further questions or just to set up a dialogue. Thanks.
Thank you.
Who was the last question? I forgot. I didn't get the name.
Nisha.
Nisha. Okay.
And Sanjay asked about minimalism. Yeah.
So Indira, great to see you on this call. And hats off to you for all the incredible work you've been doing. Insane trade, yes. So Helena Norberg Hodge, who Indira has mentioned, is author of a really wonderful book called Ancient Futures, which is based on her work in Ladakh. And she's the one who started a global movement or organization called Local Futures, which is really pushing for localization. They've been doing it for many years, but are especially active now, given the current situation. One of the things she does talk about is how corporations rule our lives, and how WTO and corporations have enabled an incredible amount of trade of goods and services around the world, which is part of what I was talking about earlier, the economic globalization that has destroyed local production systems, that has enabled the transfer of pathogens across the world, that's created global problems of many, many different kinds. And it's something that we have to fight against. So again, it's about the fight for localization, which is against this kind of global trade in goods and services and people, and for much more local control of the kind that we've been talking about. Do take a look at Local Futures. There's a website and the work that Helena and a lot of her colleagues are doing on the potential and possibilities of localization. So thanks for mentioning that, Indira. Sanjay, minimalistic lifestyle. Easy to talk about, very difficult for many of us, including myself, to practice. I think there's 2 or 3 elements in this. One, what we can change in our personal lives. We can do things like, for instance, living without a fridge. I've been doing it for the last 12, 13 years now, or cycling as much as possible rather than using vehicles. No? But there's a limit to how much we can do on our own individually. And that limit is set by society or by politics. So for instance, I say cycling, but then in Pune, cycling is extremely dangerous. And it's health hazard because I'm breathing in huge amounts of pollution. So we also then need to be part of a social movement which argues for safe cycle lanes and for non-polluted cities in order for us to also change that part of our lifestyle. So minimalistic lifestyles are a combination of our own individual personal choices to the extent we can make them, and societal changes that can come about only through collective action. But there's a lot that we can do even in the first part, which I think we don't do enough of, including myself. I guess one of the biggest things, since many of you are climate activists, would also be travel. How much should we travel, and by what form should we travel? So there's a whole global movement now called Stay Grounded, which is trying to, right now, in fact, protest against the fact that governments are thinking of huge multi-trillion-dollar bailouts for the airline industry, not for migrant workers. And that's just crazy priorities, right? So we have to be part of movements against that, even as we question our own traveling lifestyles, for instance. Nisha, social enterprises. Yeah, I think there's a great deal of potential for social enterprises. And by sustainable social enterprises, I'm talking about things like the producer companies that I mentioned earlier. And that can be in all kinds of production systems and all kinds of service systems. It's not only with agriculture and so on. It could be with any production where you can create the social non-profit enterprise. There is also for-profit social enterprise, and maybe I have question marks about that, because capitalistic profit is itself part of the problem. But you can create systems. I mean, again, going back to some of the positive things in Europe, for instance, there's the whole social and solidarity economy. Many young people setting up non-profit shops, non-profit cafes, justice shops and cafes where migrant people or so-called disabled people are the ones who get priority in employment, and so on. We have them in India. We have, for instance, a restaurant run in Bombay, I think also one in Bangalore, which employs only visually impaired people. Now, a restaurant run by visually impaired people sounds, how is that possible? But it is. I mean, people have shown that that's possible. Or enterprises like, let's say, Selco with solar that only works for the energy security of the poorest households. So I think there's a great deal of potential there, much more than currently is achieved, especially in India. And we have to push again for both creating those models and examples to show what's possible and showcasing the ones that are already there, and pushing for policy shifts. Like what I said originally, why not a policy which says that all production will happen in small scale and medium scale, where it can, only that which cannot happen in small and medium scale will be in the large scale, and that small and medium scale will be producer owned. Even the large scale can be producer owned, but small scale is much easier. So that can be a policy shift that we can fight for. Thanks.